when I told him that we would arrange an exhibition here in Leiden, he smiled to me and he was like Charlie in the Chocolate Factory.
Absolutely.
Because he loves the old Dutch masters. Just as I did in my student time, I was more in the Rijksmuseum as on the university. So I understand his feelings very well. And it's a great pleasure that he will tell us something today about the old Dutch masters, what we didn't know until today. Thank you, Laurin.
Thank you, Jan. It's a treat to be. There are two things that interest me. Any opportunity to come back to the Netherlands is welcome in my book. And then those of you that know my paintings, and you'll see a few in the show here, you know that the biggest influence, we have a interesting feedback here. Is this better? Yeah, a little bit. Okay. Biggest influence on my work are the still life painters of the Netherlands, long time before it was the Netherlands, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Particularly a painter by the name of Willem Koff. I loved him because he painted black backgrounds, and after a while that became a signature of mine. I'm trying to get away from it because now a lot of people, as you'll see in the next room, paint black backgrounds. So you have to stay ahead of the crowd. I was over here about a month ago in Bologna with the Fabriano group, and on the way home I caught this terrible cold, and so rather than try to talk for 45 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, by that time you would have all left anyway, I'm going to show you the first part of a 5-part video that I put together on this subject. But give me a couple of minutes now to give you, what we call the backstory. Sometimes the story that makes things happen is more interesting than the things that actually happen. Right?
Yes.
So about 15 years ago, when I was really getting into, I took my first watercolor lesson the year I turned 60. So I never watercolored before that. And so in the last 20 years, I've painted a lot. But it was really about 15 years ago, and I was painting like so many people in the world. I was painting with Arches paper, and I just realized that something was wrong, fundamentally wrong with it. And the same thing with Winsor Newton brushes. Up until that point, they had been absolutely the best products anybody had in the world. And all of a sudden, you buy Winsor Newton Series 7, and all of a sudden the Kolinsky hair starts falling out of it. So I just, I'm an architect by training, and for 50-something years, I practice as an architect. As an architect, if you specify a roof for a building, you do research on roofs. You find the roof that's ideal for that building. And I realized that I hadn't done any research on brushes or paints or anything. I just took the word of the first teacher I had, and that seems to be the way it is around the world. Whoever was your first teacher told you these were the right brushes and the paint and the paper, and you've just been using them ever since, but never stopping to ask, what is really the right brush, the right paper, and the right paint for me? And so the situation with Arches, Arches has been sold 5 times in the last 15 years, and they have engineered a lot of the quality out of the paper. And it's a shame because it was, it was the workhorse of watercolor paper. You could hardly destroy it. So I started researching paper. I ordered paper from all over the world. I even went places and visited paper manufacturers and asked them what was so special about their paper and all that. And of course, about that time, we all got involved in Fabriano aquarella, and so I was ending up now. I'd already started a correspondence with one of the senior people at the Fabriano mill in Fabriano, and I was finding out a lot about paper. And so I continued that. I visited several paint manufacturers, and during that I ended up going to Seattle and visiting for a couple of days with John Cogley, the owner there, and I tried lots and lots and lots of paints. Now, I'm not here to sell you Fabriano Artistico. For me personally, Fabriano Artistico 300-pound soft press fits my style of painting perfectly. The painting that's in the next room there, a typical silver and crystal piece that I would do, is painted on just that paper, 300-pound soft press. Fabriano is the only company that makes a soft press finish. But I'm not here to sell you Fabriano paper. I'm here to sell you on the idea of getting more involved in selecting the paper and the paint. You may find out that you've been fighting the brush that you're using. I see this all the time. I teach workshops all over the world, and I see that more people are using the wrong brush for the right thing. I said, you know, why are you using that squirrel brush to do all this little bitty detail when a Kolinsky Sable number 4 is meant for that kind of detail? Here, try one of these, and it turns these people's lives around. So again, I'm not selling Escoda brushes. They're fabulous for me. I love them. I love Daniel Smith paint, but I'm not selling you Daniel Smith paint. I hope you'll try it, and if you like it, all the better. And you may find that there are probably 6 different paint colors made by 6 different manufacturers that really fit your style of painting. So don't be shy about that, and don't be married totally to anybody's product. I'm in an interesting situation with Escoda and Fabriano and Daniel Smith, and that they are my sponsor, and they take really good care of me, and I help them, as we did several years ago. John Cogley came to me and he said, Laurin, we make 5 blacks. I understand you mix your own black. Why can't one of our 5 blacks meet your needs? And so I told him. And so he came back to me 6 months later and said, Laurin, why don't you work with our scientists in Seattle, and let's make a black that fits your needs. One of the things I wanted was a really transparent black. Sounds like a bit of an anomaly, doesn't it? But remember, all paints in watercolor are transparent. It doesn't matter how dark they are still transparent. And one of the reasons I wanted a transparent black is because I do an underpainting under that black. And if I want to warm up the whole painting, I may put a quinacridone gold under the black. Or if it has a lot of silver in it and I want it to look very metallic, I may do a phthalo blue red shade behind that black, so it looks very steely and metallic like. So John liked those things, and he says until he just created a blue that he's about to bring on the market, which may be the most expensive paint color that anybody's ever made. It's going to sell for north of $100 a tube. But up until that point, the McCracken Black was the most complex color they had ever made to sell. It has 6 different hues in it to make the McCracken Black. I hope you'll try it. I'll give you a little free tip. If you look at the painting it's in the wall, that's silver and crystal with a big magnolia in the front of it, not hard to miss in there. Most of the silver is actually painted with neutral tint, because I don't want that silver to go so black that it disappears into my background. So I use the neutral tint to lay in all the base of the silver, and then right at the end, before I do the black background very last, and right before I put it in, I go in and add some McCracken Black to the absolute darkest shadows in the silver, so it will harmonize with the black background. So anyway, have fun with it. John Cogley will fix you up with a tube in the room down the hall down here. So what we're going to do today is I'm in the process of writing a history, a modern history of watercolor. You know, there are a lot of people that will tell you that the Chinese invented watercolor, but they didn't. They invented a colored ink that works really, really well on mulberry paper, but I'll explain to you in this little video. I'm only going to give you about a 12, 14-minute video. Those that want to sit through and suffer the whole hour and a half, you're welcome to do that. But I think you'll get a sense of what I do. And what I'm reaching out to you today is look at the history of watercolor. I don't think very many people in the Netherlands realize what an important role watercolor played in the development of Dutch painting, particularly painters like Van Ness, who was one of the great botanic painters. You know, he's the man that sort of set the standard for doing these monstrous bouquets of flowers with all the little salamanders and the mice and all of the ants running all over the peonies, because you know these painters were really botanists, and so they've got ants running all over the peonies, because without the ants the peony can't open. So if you really understand what Van der Est was painting, what he was painting with those flowers, then you can learn a lot about botany. I started looking at all of this and tried to find, you know, watercolor paper hasn't been around forever. You know, it really is only in the 1730s that the first watercolor paper was ever made. And so what we're talking about is pigment that mixes with water and paints on paper and uses gum arabic or honey as a carrier to get into the paper. That's what modern watercolor is all about. So with that, if we could take a look at this this first few minutes. It's going to end relatively abruptly, and I apologize. You're going to have a big advert about my paintings at the very beginning, but the people that recorded this wanted to convince my audiences that, yeah, Laurin McCracken actually can paint. So you're going to see some paintings here.
Hello. I'm Laurin McCracken. I'm an unabashed realist watercolorist. Welcome to my studio here in Fort Worth, Texas, in the United States of America. I've been teaching workshops for over 15 years, and the biggest problem I see with my participants is a basic lack of knowledge of the fundamentals of how watercolor is supposed to be used and the proper tools with which to paint. It is their lack of understanding of this primary knowledge that keeps artists from painting the way they want to and enjoying the medium as much as they should. I've joined with Terracotta to create a series of videos to share with you what are the tools that you should be using. Where did they come from? How did they get invented? And how do you use them to their best advantage? We're going to explore the basic tools used in watercolor, and then in future videos, I'm going to show you how to most efficiently use these tools using the methods that were formulated in what we know as the British transparent watercolor techniques. These are the techniques that were formulated during the Victorian era in England and are still pretty much the standards for the medium around the world. You may know watercolorists that use other methods. These are watercolorists that either haven't had exposure to the transparent watercolor techniques or they have chosen to use a different method. Using the methods I will be presenting will make your efforts easier, more efficient, more effective, and hopefully more enjoyable. Once you master these basic tools and techniques, you can open up your world to the many specialized products and additional techniques that are available for watercolorists. We will be discussing some of these in a later video. The basic fact is that watercolor is a very technically driven medium. In many ways, it is as technologically and process driven as etchings. I don't believe that anybody would go out and buy a sheet of copper, some sulfuric acid, some etching needles, and asphaltum, and try to create an etching without some basic, fundamental instruction. Watercolorists need this same kind of basic instruction, but they're very limited in where you can get it. We have produced this series of videos to solve that problem. One of the blessings of watercolor is it's so available and affordable. You can walk into any shop and get some paper, a few brushes, a few paints at a very reasonable cost, and be ready to watercolor. However, many people do this, and without any basic instructions, they try to create watercolor paintings and they get very frustrated. Artists that have just purchased watercolor equipment don't know how to get the pans of paint into liquid. They don't know how to load or handle the brush, and don't know how to use all this equipment. It can be a real train wreck. Watercolor often gets the bum rap of being very difficult. But it's not if you know the techniques and you know the basics and you've practiced these basics. After that, you'll only be limited by how hard you want to work and what do you want to get out of being a watercolorist. These videos are designed to get you on the right track and will guide you through the process of painting a watercolor you can be proud of. It can be a very rewarding experience if you know what you're doing. This first video will cover the 3 basic tools you will need to get started: brushes, paper, and paint. There's a lot of discussion out there about, oh, I think the brushes are the most important part of watercolor. Oh, no, it's the paint that you use that's the basics. Oh, no, it has to be the paper. Let's just put all that aside. It's the balance of the 3 of these basic tools that makes for a good watercolor. We will cover why there is such a large range of prices that you can pay for watercolor products, and when it makes sense to buy the more expensive items. Like most things in life, you get what you pay for. Sometimes it might be the right idea to spend more than might at first seem to be justified, but thrifty is not always the right answer. It depends on what the results that you're trying to achieve. Let me give you some background that might be helpful to you as you get into using watercolor and wonder why this happens and why do people use this, that, and the other. This information comes from a fair amount of research that I have done over the last 10 years. There really isn't a current book that gives a history of watercolor. There are bits and pieces that you can get from different books. Most of those books are out of print. And most of the information that I'm sharing with you I actually got from the manufacturers of materials today and their understanding of the history of this medium. If you listen to many pundits, it's been around for 3,000, maybe 10,000 years. Well, that is true to some extent. There have been water-based media out there. The caves in Le Chaux in France show the Neanderthal man recording bisons and deer running through their forests. And the Chinese will tell you they invented watercolor 3,000 years ago. But the kind of work that is in the caves in Le Chaux bears little relationship to the way we do watercolor today. Watercolor first became a publicly available and popular painting medium during the Victorian era in England in 1837 to 1901, about. During this period, there was a general prosperity in England. This was in time when the new industrial age got under a full head of steam and the economy expanded and grew and everyone profited from it. And art had a new audience. Royalty and the large landowners who had for a long time controlled who bought what and were the primary patrons of the art no longer controlled the economy. Shipping became a major industry. Mining, the railroads, large farming, All of these became part of big industry and helped shape the economy of England. More people became wealthy, and a middle class with disposable income emerged. This created a nationwide interest by everybody for art. The Royal Academy in London was created during this period from a royal warrant from the King of England. This gave oil painters a forum to show their paintings and to sell their art. Within this institution was a group of artists that wanted watercolor to be seen as an important medium on its own and become commercially viable as a medium. Out of the Royal Academy was formed the Royal Watercolor Society with a royal warrant from Queen Victoria. This group today is known as the Royal Society of Painters in Watercolor. This gave watercolorists the right to show and sell their paintings. Later, a splinter group was formed, the Royal Institute of Painters in Watercolor, with its own royal warrant, and in 1876, the Royal Scottish Society of Painters in Watercolor was created and received their own warrant from the Queen. After the turn of the century, this model was adopted in the United States as watercolor societies, and they were created all over the country. Today, there are more than 125 watercolor societies in the United States. Queen Victoria was a major influence in the growth and the interest of watercolor. She, like all royals, was a watercolorist. And as the most beloved monarch in Britain's history, whatever Queen Victoria liked, everyone liked. This created a huge growth of interest in watercolor, not only among the professional artists, but among the general public as well. Here's a small illustration of a watercolor done by Queen Victoria of one of her children. And when she traveled, she always traveled with a watercolor kit. You'll remember that Queen Victoria was originally from Germany and went back there often. This is a little sketch she did from her bedroom window while visiting in Coburg, Germany. But again, it was the interest in watercolor by the Queen that created a huge growth of interest in watercolor. And this was championed by the professional watercolors because, like today, the more people that are interested in watercolor, the more people are interested in purchasing watercolor and adding watercolors to their art collection. Another major factor in the growth of popularity of watercolor was the improved accessibility to watercolor supplies. This was, in many ways, a product of the Industrial Revolution. During this period, mining was growing in England, and this allowed for the growing interest in tin. An American, John Goff, from Charleston, was visiting in England, and he liked what you could do with tin. It was very malleable. It could be made into really thin sheets. These thin sheets could be folded, they could be soldered, they could be crimped, and they can be made into paint cans and paint tins. So he was the inventor of the tin tube for storing paint, not only just watercolor, but all kinds of paint. It is interesting to note that he was just interested in inventing things and not necessarily making money for them. He didn't patent the tin tube. That was patented later by others who got a lot of money from that. But Mr. Goff went back to the United States very happy that he had advanced an industry in the world market. Previously, if you were a watercolorist and you wanted paint of any kind, you went to the apothecary. And you either had that person make you the paint, or from the apothecary you purchased the ingredients and ground your own paints. But the major issue became, how do you store these paints? And how do you transport them? For many years, particularly watercolorists, were confined to their studio because they couldn't take glass containers of paint with them into the field until the tin tube came along and changed that. For many years, artists used pig bladders to store their paints. These tended to dry out, crack, and create messy spills. Can you imagine opening your paint kit and finding cerulean blue all over everything? While many other containers were tried, such as small glass jars, glass syringes, and we can see some of this history on this wonderful board that was created by the Winsor Newton Paint Company, where it moves from pig's bladders all the way up to tin tubes. It really was this invention of the tin tube that made watercolor easily accessible and took it out of the studio and created the movement toward plein air painting. At the beginning of this era, as I've noted, most artists mixed their own paints. With the invention of the tin tube came the creation of the trade of paint manufacturers, known at the time as colormen. Now, if you wanted to paint, you could go to the paint manufacturer and outfit yourself with the paints you needed, or order special colors, depending on the size of your pocketbook. You could purchase watercolors in tin tubes, in semi-dry form, in pans, just as you can today. Today, the paints that are available to us have evolved and improved a great deal since the Victorian era. If you're careful about your paints, you can get paint that is light fast and in a virtually unending array of colors. Paint manufacturing has become the venue of the scientist, because the major paint manufacturers employ scientists for inventing new colors and especially for quality control. We now have safe cadmium paints. We no longer have paints that contain lead. We have paints that will not change color over time. That was a remarkable breakthrough. This is something that many artists didn't realize would happen to their paintings over time. It's why Turner's sons sometimes turned black. We also have now a lot of different kinds of paints. We have those highly granulated paints, such as the Daniel Smith Primatex series. And then we also have those absolutely smooth paints, such as the quinacridons. This was all a growth that came later, after the invention of the tin tube made watercolor so accessible and affordable once they started making it in mass.
Painting to show you how to get the most utilization out of all these types of things, types of brushes and paper and everything. And I wish we had 2 hours here to talk about that, because I really enjoy it when you get into talking about paper and you find out why there is a rough, why there is a cold press, and what is it meant to be used. And so hopefully at some point out there we'll get this more available to you. I think one of the most interesting things about the history of the development of, and I go into it later when I'm talking about more about how paint was manufactured and everything, is, and I learned this from talking to some of my watercolor friends from India, that you heard me mention in the thing, is that all royals were required to be watercolorists. It was just part of it, and it goes back like 700 years. And all military officers in the English Army, Navy, Marines, all the branches of the military are required to be watercolorists. And this came from the time when England was commanding the seas around the world, and they were conquering countries and islands and things like that. Well, how are you going to go back and tell Victoria what her new island looked like? There were no cameras, obviously. So each of the officers on a man of war had a particular specialty. You are supposed to go out and paint the indigenous people. You're to go out and paint the buildings they lived in. You're to go out and paint the landscape they lived in. If they had any kind of conveyances, you're the conveyance specialist. And so everybody had an assignment, and there were botanists on every man of war. There were all kinds of, there were map makers, there were surveyors, all of that. And the surveyors back in then were also watercolorists, because they not only measured the heights and everything, they also painted the lay of the land. And so when they got back to London, they could show the Queen what she had just added to her kingdom. And that still applies today. almost every senior officer in the military, in the English military, is a watercolorist. And so, and here's the really interesting story, talking about backstories, is that you're all aware that England controlled India for a long, long time. And they didn't do it in a very nice way. And so when Queen Victoria took over the throne, she heard how the Indians and the Pakistanis and all this were being persecuted by the English. And she said, that's not the way we're going to be in charge of India. She said, I want every officer who's in charge, and remember, India back then was a whole bunch of little principalities, the Maharajas, the Maharanis, and all that. And then when England took over, they were great big states under a very senior colonel or general or somebody like that. So she put the word out that the leaders of all these big states, the majors, the generals, should invite the Maharajas and the Maharanis to dinner. That was going to solve the whole problem. Well, obviously it didn't. You know, the only thing the Indians knew that is the English dressed up at dinner. And that's the only thing they didn't know. But they didn't know what that meant. They just knew that they wore a bib and tucker, or whatever a bib and tucker was. And so they didn't know what clothes to wear, so the ladies just showed up in their best saris, and the English ladies came out in their ball gowns. And the generals came out in their dress blues with their swords and their hats and everything. And so it took a while for the Indians to figure out what they could wear that would offset what the English would wear. A bigger problem was they didn't know what to talk about. Just there were these long, silent dinners because they had nothing in common. Finally, some of the brightest of the most influential families in India heard that all of the officers could paint in watercolor. So they all went out and took watercolor lessons so they would have something to talk to the English about at dinner. And that reinforced, obviously, what the officers were doing in painting. They all went out and painted together, and that's why today there is this huge potential growth in watercolor in India, because even today, the more wealthy you are in India, you're supposed to be a watercolorist. And now we've got the fastest growing middle class in the world out there. They want to learn watercolor. So potentially the largest watercolor market in the world is India after the United States. So these are the kind of things I'm learning, and I'm fascinated with them. Now, whether we'll ever put it into a book or not, I don't know. It's easier for me to just to talk about them because I think it's a lot more fun to hear the stories than to read the stories. But anyway, does anybody have any question about anything that you saw up here, or anything you'd like me to that I haven't touched on that you'd like to hear about or thought you might hear about when you came?
How long will Kolinsky be available?
Well, you make a really, really good point. I assume that all of you are aware that the Chinese have taken over all of the fur industry in the world, and they are buying all of the Kolinsky pelts from Siberia. And the Chinese won't buy a pelt if it doesn't have a tail on it. So all of the Kolinsky tails that would have been harvested in Siberia to sell to the European primarily and the American market are all going to China. Now the Chinese are not dumb people. They realize there's something to be made money out of, but they're not the most forthcoming folks in the industry, and so they have already established a pretty firm standard that they're going to adulterate anything they ship out there. So the Escoda people, for instance, are having a really, really difficult time getting Kolinsky hair of any sort to start with. and they found that almost every Chinese supplier they've used so far has been adulterating the Kolinsky with squirrel and horse and other hares out there. So what you can expect to see is that, first of all, fewer and fewer and fewer Kolinsky brushes being sold in the in the world market, and the price is already going up. The larger Kolinskys are now at about $1,000, where several years ago they were in the 200 thing, and nobody knows where it's going. And the people at Escoda tell me that they can foresee a time in the next 6 to 10 months where there won't be any Kolinsky sable hares available at any price. The price they're paying in China right now is 110 times what they were paying a year ago. So, one, they won't be available, and number two, we won't be able to afford them anyway. So that's why every brush manufacturer out there is trying to do like Escoda has and create an artificial Kolinsky by adding texture to their nylons. Two have been able to, one in addition to Escoda have been able to do that so far, but everybody's spending a lot of R&D time and money trying to find something to replace the basic Kolinsky. So if you have Kolinsky sable brushes, use them with caution, because I give, as it said in the thing, I give a lot of workshops, and invariably somebody's going to come up to me and say, "Oh, I've got this Kolinsky 10. I've been using it for 15 years. It's a great brush." And I said, "No, it isn't. About 10 years ago, you wore all the tip off of it, and it's just an okay brush. It's not a true Kolinsky brush by any stretch of the imagination anymore. All brushes wear out. I don't care if they're synthetic, animal hair, everything. No brush lasts forever." And I see these people coming to my workshops with all these dull, rounded points where 15 years ago they wore all the ends off of all their pointed brushes and can't figure out why they can't get nice points or nice thin lines anymore. So it's a bit of a problem. Right, Michael?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for your time and your interest. If I can answer any questions, I'll be around the next couple of days. Be happy to talk about any of this with you. Appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. Actually, we have been now as well in the chocolate factory hearing all your wonderful news. You have an amazing knowledge of many things. And now I know why I'm so happy to have been 25 years a Royal Navy officer.
All right. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.